President.
Senator from Michigan.
Mr. President, as ranking member on the Subcommittee on Science, Space, and Competitiveness, I know how important it is for our country to invest in scientific research and to make informed decisions based on those findings. Sound science has played a critical role in the United States, becoming a leader in fields like space exploration, medical research, advanced manufacturing, and other high-tech industries. So when 97% of scientists in a particular field agree on a serious problem, it is wise for policymakers to listen. The scientific community is sounding the alarm about the urgent need to address the causes of global climate change. Scientists here in the United States and across the world overwhelmingly agree that the weight of evidence is clear. Global temperatures are rising. Dramatic changes in weather and climate have accompanied this warming, and humans are largely responsible due to our emissions of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Military leaders, doctors, economists, and biologists are among the experts warning us about global climate change and the fact that it is a major threat to national security, public health, our economy, and our natural resources. Unfortunately, powerful special interests led by some organizations and companies in the fossil fuel industry are deliberately spreading false information about climate change to influence public opinion and to muddle the truth. The strategy to confuse the public about climate change science and delay policy action has many parallels to the strategy used by Big Tobacco to mislead the public about scientific evidence linking smoking to lung cancer and heart disease. The corporations spreading disinformation on climate change are the very same interests that have the most to gain financially by stopping meaningful action to reduce greenhouse gases, protect our clean air, and address global warming for future generations. The Koch brothers are a prime example of this fact. Charles and David Koch made their vast fortunes from owning companies that profit from a range of dirty industries. Much of their wealth is funneled into activist groups that produce questionable information and the spin necessary to support their own interests. The web of denial that they have created is a threat to sound, science-based decision-making. While some big polluters seek to confuse and cloud the judgment of decision-makers and the public, the American people continue to suffer the consequences of our dependence on fossil fuels. These consequences are not just limited to rising global temperatures. The people of Michigan are paying for the cost of coal and oil pollution in many ways, but I'd like to focus on just a couple of them. A few years ago, a 3-story high pile of petroleum coke, or pet coke, which you can see here in this image, lined the banks of the Detroit River in the open air. Pet coke is essentially the industrial byproduct that is produced during the oil refining process. These particular piles were owned by Koch Carbon, a company controlled by the Koch brothers. Usually, pet coke is shipped off to other countries where it is burned as fuel, worsening terrible air quality problems in places like China and contributing to global climate change. In this case, the banks of the Detroit River were being treated as a dumping ground to store these mountains of pet coke. The wind would blow the pet coke dust everywhere, including into the homes and lungs of those living in the neighborhoods nearby. It was even documented blowing across the river into Windsor, Ontario. Not only was the air being contaminated, the pet coke was fouling the Great Lakes, a source of drinking water for nearly 40 million people. And when it rained, pollution would run off from the piles into the Detroit River, which is part of the Great Lakes system. I joined residents in Detroit to call for these pet coke piles to be moved, and only through a community-wide effort were they eventually successful. I've also introduced legislation to study the health and environmental impacts of this pet coke. But unfortunately, this same area of Detroit that has had to deal with mountains of particulate matter blowing into the air already had the distinction of having some of the worst air quality in the nation. Research shows that exposure to air pollution at a young age can lead to health problems like asthma, and air pollution can worsen asthma symptoms. Detroit has the highest rate of asthma in young children among the 18 largest cities in the United States. Over 12% of Detroit children have asthma. The national rate is around 8%. Most air pollution comes from burning of fossil fuels, and parts of Detroit are dealing with high pollutant levels as a result. I wrote a letter along with Senator Stabenow calling for a plan to reduce sulfur dioxide levels in southwest Detroit and comply with federal clean air standards. The Michigan Department of Environmental Quality finally just submitted their plan to comply over a year past the initial deadline. These examples in Detroit show how protecting clean air and clean water are often environmental justice issues. Those that are most affected by pollution are often from low-income and minority households. Addressing climate change will also improve the air quality of these affected areas. And while these communities bear the brunt of fossil fuel pollution, the Koch brothers and others pour hundreds of millions and even billions of dollars into activities to avoid regulation of their dirty industries. One of the tactics that powerful corporate industries use is to bankroll numerous front groups to spread misinformation. The idea behind this strategy is to use seemingly independent organizations, such as think tanks, to deliver misleading messages that the public might rightfully dismiss if they had heard them directly from industry. They have calculated that it is better for business to mislead the American public rather than acknowledge the scientific evidence and their role in climate change and join the effort to combat this growing threat to our planet. It's a page taken right out of Big Tobacco's playbook by creating their own scientific studies and policy papers from a network of surrogates. It gives the appearance that there is a legitimate debate over the fundamentals of climate change science. One example is the Cato Institute. For years, the organization has received funding from fossil fuel interests such as ExxonMobil and the Koch family. At the same time, Cato spreads climate skepticism. Over a span of 15 years, the Cato Institute published 773,000 words and 768 documents expressing climate skepticism. The web of denial is intended to manufacture doubt among the American public in order to delay action. But the spending efforts by the same corporations also specifically target elected officials and other key decision makers to prevent meaningful action on global warming. The Koch brothers have poured vast sums of money into election ads, lobbying efforts, and campaign donations, often funneled through other organizations to hide the source of the funding. As a result, I've heard many climate myths repeated in the halls of Congress that were carefully crafted by the network of climate denial front groups. Late last year, the Senate Subcommittee on Science, Space, and Competitiveness held a hearing that was specifically designed to cast doubt on the scientific evidence of climate change. The witness panel was stacked by the majority with prominent climate deniers. The one witness that I was able to invite as the ranking member was Rear Admiral David Titley, who, as the United States Navy's chief meteorologist, initiated and led the Navy's task force on climate change. At the hearing, Dr. Titley outlined how climate change is a serious threat to national security. Admiral Titley explained that the military makes decisions based on known information and calculations of risk. Often they must act on less than perfect intelligence, but they understand risk and will take action to prevent threats when given the chance. The Admiral applied this to the broad agreement among climate scientists, saying that any military commander would take action in a heartbeat, he said, and I quote, in a heartbeat, if there was a consensus among 97% of the intelligence community about a particular scenario. In fact, the military has already started taking action to anticipate vulnerabilities and mitigate the impacts related to climate change. The brightest, most experienced minds in our United States military realize that the reliance on fossil fuel leaves our troops and citizens exposed to more risk at home as well as abroad. Unfortunately, Congress has not been as quick to act. Efforts to pass meaningful legislation to address climate change have been blocked. Existing administrative efforts to reduce emissions or invest in clean energy have also been repeatedly attacked. We can and must pass legislative solutions to address global climate change. Transitioning away from fossil fuels and investing in renewable energy will create sustainable, good-paying jobs here in the United States. Taking bold action on climate change will strengthen our public health, our economy, and our national security. We must wake up and realize that those attempting to mislead and confuse must not be successful. I am confident that we will overcome this web of denial and use peer-reviewed, sound scientific information to guide our decision-making in order to create a resilient future for our children and our grandchildren. Mr. President, I yield the floor.